Well, hello and good afternoon and welcome on behalf of all of us here in the Seattle area. We are so thrilled to see you streaming into this virtual space this afternoon. My name is Sam. I work for Third Place Books. And on behalf of all of us here at Third Place Books, I am thrilled to welcome you to this evening and afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. We've seen folks from all over the country to celebrate the release of Klara and the Sun. Third Place Books, many of you know, has 3 locations in the Seattle area. We've got a store in Lake Forest Park, one in Ravenna, and one at Seward Park. We are an independent bookstore. And we are so happy to join our friends at Village Books in Bellingham and at the Elliott Bay Book Company down on Capitol Hill in Seattle in this event this afternoon. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for letting us share this afternoon with you. We are thrilled.
All right, and hello everyone. Thank you, Sam. My name is Claire. I'm the event coordinator for Village Books in Bellingham and Linden, Washington. We're representing the Northwest Washington contingent today, and we are delighted to be partnering with Third Place Books and Elliott Bay Book Company. This has been such a pleasure and an honor and to be part of this team. And we appreciate it. And I just want to say hello to all of our Village Books people. Thank you for representing today. So sit back, please enjoy the show. And thank you so much to our guests for coming today.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Sam, and your colleagues at Village and at Third Place. My name is Rick Simonson, and I work at Elliott Bay Book Company in Seattle. And we are honored and delighted to be helping present this program with Kazuo Ishiguro in conversation with Ruth Ozeki. I could say a little bit about Elliott Bay. I'm not going to say too much because we really do want to move this program into the happening, especially because it's well into the evening over in England, where our friend Mr. Ishiguro is. But to say for us, what in doing this program, it does bring a history of helping host and present Kazuo Ishiguro in Seattle, a time that started in 1989 when he came to Seattle for the then newly published The Remains of the Day, a book which I think at that point was longlisted for the Booker Prize and which would go on to win the Booker Prize, but at that stage of things was a book that not so many in this country knew about. It really was the introduction of his work in the United States, though his first 2 books had been published here. They were actually published in a series with other Japanese authors. And I could tell stories about how I came to find out about his work, especially through the guidance of the man who was his longtime publisher, Sonny Mehta, who published that book in 1989 and passed away in December 2019. But actually, one of the last things he actually had was an early manuscript, or an early version of Klara and the Sun. So Ish's work in this country has sort of spanned the time that Sonny Mehta was putting books in all of our hands, we booksellers, but also therefore readers. Ish has come to Seattle and has certainly been with us and all readers with a series of books that he wrote, has written from Remains of the Day to his subsequent novels, The Unconsoled, Never Let Me Go, When We Were Orphans, and then he did not come over for his book of stories, Nocturnes, but then in 2016 came for the publication of The Buried Giant, the last novel that preceded Klara and the Sun, and was a wonderful visit then, as all his earlier visits were. Since that time, there was one other public event that really happened. That was his receiving the Nobel Prize in 2017, an extraordinary occasion. And his other honors besides the Nobel then were the 1989 Booker Prize, and for which he was also nominated on other occasions. And he's received significant honors in the countries of Japan and France for his work. He is here today and this evening with Klara and the Sun, and you will hear more about this in the conversation that comes between he and Ruth Ozeki, who we're delighted is joining us today. Ruth also is known to readers and audiences in Seattle and Bellingham, as she has been visited with her 3 novels, My Year of Meats, All Over Creation, the 2013 novel, A Tale for the Time Being, her book-length essay, The Face, A Time Code. And there were a few other pieces to her biography I was going to say that she teaches at Smith College. She has become an ordained Zen Buddhist priest. And that was more or less it. Then we got word that there was one more item to add, which is the welcome news that this fall we'll see the publication of a new novel, a much awaited new novel, The Book of Form and Emptiness, coming in September. So we will be doing something, we all hope, one form or another, this form or maybe in person by that time. We do wish we were doing this in person, as much as this lets people be where they are. I was thinking about, with a lot of anticipation as we were getting ready to do this today, of what it would be like in a large hall that we would be doing this with Ish and with Ruth, being able to do the same thing. And I was thinking of the emptiness and the quiet of that large hall before everyone had arrived, and what that feels like when you're in there with a few technical people, and it's there's a quiet, but there's the occasional voice, and there's maybe the sound check going on. There's a bit of that, and then people get to come in and doing this. Everyone comes in the way Zoom happens, in this rush of entry. But instead be this gradual gathering of people, and the human voices, and that sort of audible hum that builds, and the anticipation that's there because everyone knows why they're there, and then the quiet because one of us would be up there to introduce the program, that kind of stillness and that arrested sort of to what's going on, and that's brought us to focus to what's about to happen, and then the applause, and then what it was. I think one of the things about Ish that this will bring out in a different way, is a writer who has, in his writing, there's an intimacy in the narrative voice that works on the page, but also is very much a part of him on stage. I mean, you're a large hall, but you have this feeling that he's speaking to you. There's a deliberateness in his voice, in his speaking, as well as in the writing, and that happens, and he's unique in that. This, I think, is one of the things that doing these things in Zoom will let happen, is that you'll get to sort of that intimacy, is because we're all in our own intimate places. So you will that will be drawn out. But I think there's that quality he's unique with, which is there in his writing. And this book, which beautifully delineates aspects because of the central character, who is an artificial friend, asks questions about what it is to be human, or what it is not to be human, and the different aspects of that that are drawn out and explored in remarkable form. So today, I will turn this over shortly. I will disappear, and Ruth Ozeki will then take things in hand. But we ask that you. There will be a time after their conversation for you to put questions in the Q&A. We'd ask one other thing. This is especially at Ish's request, that you identify where you are. So this has been in a sense that if we're in a hall and you were standing in a microphone and you get some sense of who you are, just to help locate us all. To say, so if you're in Anacortes, say your name, and you're in Anacortes, or you're in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. We've had people from there at these, wherever you are, just to say that, as well as your name. So to give a little more to that, I will pose the questions, or I'll read the questions to Ish, but also Ruth. If you have questions for Ruth Ozeki, they want this to be a sort of a back and forth thing, as I think you will see that they can do. And so that will all happen, and we will all enjoy and get to know this, to have this time. Many of you, all of you here, are getting books if you have not gotten them. So there's also that, just to thank you as part of all this. And I know at our bookstores that are open, it's been this great feeling to watch people who have walked in, and that air of looking, they don't want to ask, they've got that thing, but they're not going to ask where the book is. And they spot this tangerine colored cover across the way, and they go to this and pick it out, and they clutch it, and then the conversations that begin to happen as they come, and the anticipation, the excitement, which is all come with the arrival of this extraordinary book. So again, for everyone at Village Books, at Third Place Books, at LA Bay Book Company, and also thanking our friends at Alfred A. Knopf, the publisher, we thank you for being here with us, and now ask you to please give good attention and virtual applause to our wonderful guests, Kazuo Ishiguro and Ruth Ozeki. Thank you both.
Well, Kazuo, are you there? Ish, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, all right, good. There you are.
I'm
Good.
not sure if I'm visible or
I think
whatever.
you are now. I think we both
Okay.
are.
I
Well,
can't tell from this end.
I know, right? It's so it's still strange. It's still strange, even though I've been doing this for a year now. We all have been doing this for a year now. It was really lovely to hear Rick's introduction and his conjuring of what it used to feel like back in the old days when we used to do in-person things, and it evoked both a kind of nostalgia, but also imagining that a terror too, because I remember how terrifying it was to be backstage, and yet here I am in my, in my my office. But in any case, the whole idea of nostalgia too, I think is something that this nostalgia and intimacy is something that, as Rick pointed out, is something that you do so well, and it's just it's wonderful to be here, even virtually, to be able to talk to you.
Well, no, it's great to be here. It's great to be in virtual Seattle, and I thought Rick did that too well.
Yeah,
he got like you. He got me really kind of quite worked up. I was
really
relaxed
nervous
until he started
yeah.
that stuff. Yeah, yeah. I think we should ask him to kind of be a little less vivid. There.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
He was very good. I mean, he just really evoked it. It was beautiful.
No, it's fantastic. He should do it. Maybe I can ask him to do it. At every event I'm doing around the States. But yeah, I have to get used to that.
That's right.
Now, shall I start off by reading a passage?
I thought that would be the best thing. Yeah. Why don't you start off by reading a little bit, just to kind of give us a sense of the tone and the voice of the book, because I think that's always nice for people to hear.
Okay, so I'm just going to do a very brief reading. Okay. And I'm literally going to read from the very beginning of the book, and I'm just going to read just over a page.
Okay.
And I'm not, although Rick was going on about the intimacy of my voice and the hall and all this. Look, when it comes to reading from my books, I'm a really bad reader. I have to tell you that. And what's more, this is supposed to be narrated by this kind of girl robot, right? And I am not a girl robot, but you're just going to have to make a huge allowance. Never mind my intimate tones. All right, so this is the very opening of Klara and the Sun.
Okay.
When we were new, Rosa and I were mid-store on the magazine's table side and could see through more than half of the window. So we were able to watch the outside, the office workers hurrying by, the taxis, the runners, the tourists, Beggarman and his dog, the lower part of the RPO building. Once we were more settled, manager allowed us to walk up to the front until we were right behind the window display. And then we could see how tall the RPO building was. And if we were there at just the right time, we would see the sun on his journey, crossing between the building tops, from our side over to the RPO building side. When I was lucky enough to see him like that, I'd lean my face forward to take in as much of his nourishment as I could. And if Rosa was with me, I'd tell her to do the same. After a minute or two, we'd have to return to our positions. And when we were new, we used to worry that because we often couldn't see the sun from mid-store, we'd grow weaker and weaker. Boy AF Rex, who was alongside us then, told us there was nothing to worry about, that the sun had ways of reaching us wherever we were. He pointed to the floorboards and said, "That's the sun's pattern right there. If you're worried, you can just touch it and get strong again." There were no customers when he said this, and manager was busy arranging something up on the red shelves, and I didn't want to disturb her by asking permission. So I gave Rosa a glance, and when she looked back blankly, I took 2 steps forward, crouched down, and reached out both hands to the sun's pattern on the floor. But as soon as my fingers touched it, the pattern faded, and though I tried all I could, I patted the spot where it had been, and when that didn't work, rubbed my hands over the floorboards. It wouldn't come back. When I stood up again, boy AF Rex said, "Klara, that was greedy. You girl AFs are always so greedy." So that's the opening to Klara and the Sun.
That is just beautiful. That is, I mean, you know, I never, it's interesting to me because this format is so intimate. And I felt like you were just sitting here reading this to me. And and I'm sure that all of the people who are listening felt the exact same way, that we were hearing a story read by Kazuo Ishiguro in a very intimate and beautiful way. So thank you. Thank you.
I'm getting very self-conscious now about this.
No, you shouldn't. You should.
People don't usually tell me that my voice is particularly intimate. But today, I mean, everyone is saying my voice is very intimate. So I'm getting kind of real intimatitis or something.
But I know, but don't you think your writing is intimate?
Well, my writing maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, that might have something to do with the roots of my writing, you know, my fiction writing, because I started off as I think I've said this in interviews, like, you know, people allege that I wanted to be a rock star before I became a writer. But that's not quite true. I wanted to be something like a failed folk singer, you know, something like that character in Inside Llewyn Davis, you know, the Coen Brothers film. That was my kind of ideal career. And I did actually, I was very successful at being this failed folk singer when I was younger. I'd often be singing in little kind of rooms, you know, purely on an amateur basis to about, you know, 40 people or something like this in a folk club, in a darkened room with just an acoustic guitar. And I think I always, that was my apprenticeship into writing stories. I was writing songs. I wrote over 100 songs for that context and that kind of atmosphere. And then I started to write short stories, and very rapidly I wrote my first novel. And I think that has never quite left my approach. At some level, you know, I like the first person, and I like that. I like the idea of the first person actually, you know, more or less addressing somebody directly. You know, there's, you know, the narrator says you, and I like that. I suppose, yeah, you could call it an intimate thing, but yeah, I kind of, it's not shouty, you know. I like that atmosphere, and there are many other things about my writing that I think has its roots in my songwriting days, but you know, we may or may not touch on those later on. But yeah, I think you're right that it's more than just a chance flattering remark by Rick Simonson. It's a tone that I've always strived for, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, when you made the transition from you know, singer-songwriter in these kind of intimate venues to writing alone, I mean, because writing is a very solitary and extremely intimate process. I mean, did that feel like a natural thing for you to make that shift?
Yeah, because when I was writing songs, I was always working on my own. I mean, you know, I was probably a bit of an egomaniac, you know, and that's what appealed to me. That's why I had to be a singer-songwriter, you know, even though I couldn't really sing very well. I had to do everything, and occasionally, you know, I would play with other people, but I must have been an awful person. I mean, I would try and control them. You know, I had very little respect for you know, the collaborative process. So, because I always had a very clear idea of what I wanted to bring into being, and that's I almost relegated myself to being a kind of a solo artist, I think. And so, yeah, writing did appeal to me, and there came a natural point, I think, when I could no longer express myself through song, mainly because I wasn't good enough in that medium, and when I started to write short stories, you know, these doors opened up, and so But as I say, I'm still somewhere. It's a bit of an exaggeration to say I'm at heart, still a songwriter. But there are many priorities in my writing that have to do with song, both in terms of technique and in terms of what I'm trying to do.
I have a couple of thoughts just in relationship to that. First, that I started out as a filmmaker and had the same kind of feeling that I wasn't a natural collaborator, that I would be happier if I were just doing this by myself. And so I remembered when I did start writing, this sense of like it's just me, and I can imagine anything I want into existence. I could imagine going to the moon, and you don't actually have to recreate that. You don't have to show it on a screen, right? You can just imagine it and put it down in its words, and then it's there, it's happening, right? And that was tremendously liberating. I guess my other feeling when you said that is, you said that perhaps you weren't good enough as a singer-songwriter, but what I'm wondering too is, the limitations, for me, I felt limited because film is such a visual medium and I am a very verbal person. And, with a song is small, right? But you write these vast worlds, right? I mean, that with many characters and all sorts of complexities going on thematically. And so I'm just wondering if perhaps a song was not enough for you.
Well, there's an element of that, but I think songs are big things.
Yeah, yeah.
They may be short, but they're pretty big. I mean, in both cases, the aim is to evoke a whole world. You open doors in people's minds.
Yeah.
And there's a big world there. And I think one of the things I've really kind of inherited from my songwriting days that still remains a priority for me. And I'll be interested to know how much you think about this, Ruth. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on holding the attention of the reader. When people are discussing writing process and creative writing classes, there's a lot of discussion about how you hold the attention of the reader, how you release information in a way that it creates suspense and so on. And these are very, very important things, obviously. But from the beginning, I've always kind of worried, perhaps more than I should, about what happens after the reading process is finished. And this question of how do you stay in people's minds? Yeah. How do you achieve that longevity? Because if you're writing a song, I mean, it's pointless to just to entertain people for the 3 minutes or something when the song is going on. Then okay, you can go away and forget it. I mean, the whole idea is that you lodge that song in people's minds. The melody that haunts, or the lyrics that haunt, the combination that haunts. So that if you do it well, and this has happened to me with many songs that I've loved all my life. They just stay with you.
Yeah.
And they come back to you at moments of emotional resonance in your life, and they're just part of your emotional furniture. And this has always been really important for me. In terms of my books, I want them to just haunt people, or not in an unpleasant way, but I can't. I'd be interested to ask two things of you, Ruth. I mean, do you actually think consciously about that? And B, do you have any idea how to achieve this? Because after all these years, I have no idea how you do it.
But okay, but you do it. I mean, and one of the things that I think so interesting about your work is the very distinctive emotional tone that is musical. I mean, it is like it's a and it's each book is different. So for example, The Buried Giant, the emotional tone there, even though many of the themes, show up in other books, but the emotional tone, the feeling of the, when I think of that book, the landscape that it evokes for me is very, very different than the landscape, for example, that a book like Never Let Me Go evokes, which is once again very different from the emotional tone of Remains of the Day. And each one has a and I use the word emotional, I think, very consciously here, because it would be hard to, in the same way that it's hard to describe through in language the way a song makes you feel, it's hard to describe how these books stay with me. And you know, it's in the last couple of weeks, knowing that I was going to have this conversation with you, I've been actually listening to audiobook recordings, which I don't normally do as much, but I've been, you know, listening to the audiobook recordings of some of your work, and that's been a whole other experience as well, because it of course, you know, the way it's performed, and the you know, the really lyrical, musical quality of your sentences. I mean, I don't know, we could talk sentences for the next, you know, 40 minutes and I would be happy, because you really are such a master of sentences. But in any case, yeah, there is a very musical, very emotional kind of resonance that I think each book has, and that's different from the next, and that really does stay with me. So, you know, perhaps it's not something you do consciously, but it certainly is. It certainly is there. It is something I think about, and I think about it formally. You know, just in terms of the structuring of a book. And I think so much of it too is about how it ends, you know, the tone that's set at the ending. But one of the things that I've always tried to do is to somehow close a book, bring some sort of structural closure to the story, but leave the larger sort of questions, and the certainly the, you know, the sort of the yeah, the emotional questions, or the you know, ethical questions, leave them open, so that those questions will linger, I think, in the reader's mind. That's always my goal. But
that's really interesting, because I suspected that might be part of what gives something, whether it's a book or indeed, you know, other forms, movies too, you know, that when things aren't quite resolved, as you say, I mean, you know, at some level the thing has to kind of resolve itself, otherwise it's just really unsatisfactory, you know. But there has to be this residue of kind of things still hanging, in a rather tantalizing way. I was suspecting that might be one of the things, but then would you worry that you're actually sacrificing something in terms of completion or completeness in the book by doing that? There's a trade-off between some kind of completeness and tidiness of the actual piece, with this ability to linger in people's minds. I mean,
I think I don't worry about it as long as structurally and formally the book ends. You know, the book has a sense of closure, you know, a formal sense of closure. And so what lingers is, in fact, you know, something else. What lingers are these larger questions. And I was just looking at when you were talking just now, it reminded me of The Buried Giant, which I happen to have right here. And the last paragraph is so beautiful. I hear him coming through the water. Does he intend a word for me? He spoke of mending our friendship. I can't believe I'm sitting here reading your Kazuo Ishiguro's, you know.
No, it sounds very intimate to me.
It is intimate though, right? Yeah. He spoke of mending our friendship. Yet when I turn, he does not look my way, only to the land and the low sun on the cove. And neither do I search for his eye. He wades on past me, not glancing back. Wait for me on the shore, friend, I say quietly. But he does not hear, and he wades on. And that, to me, is kind of the perfect ending for a book, because there's a sense of formal closure, but there's also this sense of continuity. And I think that continuity is what lingers, right? That continuity is what stays with the reader.
I think there is sometimes a trade-off, though. I mean, and I don't know. It's one of the things I worry about. My wife and I disagree quite a bit on David Lynch movies, for instance. You know, I mean, we don't disagree on his earlier work, but from kind of mid-career onwards, you know, I actually like the fact that you just don't know what the hell's going on, or you know, it's not resolved. I mean, this drives my wife kind of mad, you know, and she gets very impatient. But for me, yeah, the Lynch movies really stay in my mind, you know, the really weird ones where I don't know quite what's happened, you know, Mulholland Drive and things like that, you know, Lost Highway. But I can see that it's not for everybody, you know, and I often do end up making decisions where I think, well, yeah, I could explain more, or I could actually try and resolve these other things more, you know, but maybe it's just better to leave them.
Do you feel that I'm just curious, but is there a book that you feel that, you know, that it had the right balance of resolution and, you know, sort of openness? I mean,
I don't know. It's really hard for me to judge. I mean, this whole discussion, I mean, I find really, I like to raise this question, but I feel I can't really contribute beyond raising. I mean, it's just baffled me for decades. I mean, if I could kind of just figure this out, my life would be so much easier. You know, if this is why I keep asking you know, people like you know, to try and help me. I mean, I want all the tips I can get, and one day somebody's going to say something like, I'm going to say, right, that's it.
That's it. Right.
That's it. Now, you know, writing just got a whole lot easier. You know? But the other thing that you said on the way to this point, I mean, it's a slightly different point. I mean, you know, you've done filmmaking. You started as a filmmaker. That business you said about, you know, each of my books seeming to have a very different surface or a different world evoked. I mean, is that something? Don't you feel that is something much more normal or standard in a filmmaker's career or filmmakers? I know there are some filmmakers, you know, they're firmly in genre, you know, but filmmakers are almost expected, aren't they, to kind of move genre or, you know, tackle things in a different way. Whereas there's a kind of almost like an expectation on novelists to kind of more or less stay in the same genre or in the same kind of world. And I've always kind of taken my cue from filmmakers, you know, people like Stanley Kubrick, who you know, every time he pops up, you know, oh, now he's doing this kind of The Shining, you know, what's that got to do with 2001: A Space Odyssey or Barry Lyndon? I mean, they all seem to be kind of fully formed things from entirely different kinds of traditions, you know, and filmmakers. Well, many filmmakers have careers like that. You know, Howard Hawks and you know, many people like that. So it seems to me that's much more natural for a filmmaker. I don't know if you agree with that or not. I mean, I know that you weren't making like narrative films, so you're making documentary films, and it's kind of a little bit different. But but there's more of an expectation, I think, of filmmakers. Once you've made a film, you know, maybe your next one should actually feel and look a little bit different.
I think that's really true for American filmmakers, and you know, and I should just say Western filmmakers. The films that you mentioned were mostly American, but then I was thinking also about somebody like Ozu, you know, a Japanese filmmaker who doesn't really, you know, who's sort of stays in the same register. And does it so beautifully, you know, each one sort of getting better than the next. And so I guess I've always, I haven't really, you know, personally, I've just always felt that I should, you know, I haven't really thought about genre in that particular way. And I think you switch, it seems to me that you're really switching genre in a way that, whereas I feel like, you know, at the same time you're switching genre, there's a core at the center of the work that remains, you know, I feel like you're sort of exploring and asking the same kinds of questions in different formats, so that there is a consistency through all of your novels as well. maybe The Unconsoled was the one that sort of veered off a little bit, but there's a consistency to the kinds of questions and the kinds of, dialogue that you engage with as a reader with your books, and each one is slightly different. So each one casts a different, sort of, light on that core question. Do you think that's true?
I think that probably is true, because I think probably for me, genre or even setting, i.e. the historical time and place, it is just a part of, I see just as that's just a part of my technique. It's a technical thing.
Yes.
In other words, the core of the project, the soul of the project doesn't have much to do with the surface setting. And all right, it's a bit of an exaggeration to say, I could theoretically take any of the books I've written and move it to a different setting. But it almost feels like that. And in fact, I sometimes feel like a filmmaker going location hunting, because I have a whole story in my head. I know more or less what I want to say, what kind of emotions I want to evoke, what kind of world I want to create. And then I'm looking for the place to put it down. Is there, in the past, I used to look through history for some point in history, some time and place in history, geographically someplace and historically someplace. But these days, maybe I just got tired of looking in history books and things. I just kind of make up some sort of some kind of imaginary world. But it's been a more expendable or movable thing for me. But is that the case for you? You're probably more embedded. I mean, your settings are probably more integral to your project. Is that? Am I correct in thinking that?
Or are you just? I actually don't think about setting all that much. I think So I think that might be the case, that the setting is not something I think about from the outset. It's something that is just assumed as part of the story. I mean, I wrote my second novel was set on a potato farm in Idaho, but I wanted to write about genetic engineering technology and food. And so, I had to choose a crop, and the crop I chose was potatoes, because there's something kind of roly-poly and kind of cute about potatoes. And, they're so American, right? I wanted to talk about America, right? And so then Idaho was the place that, where things had to be set. So I think that this, for me, setting is secondary. But this actually does bring up another question that I was just really curious to ask you about, which was the shift you made. I mean, because I also, I'm in a, position, and I think this is something that we share, of being, people of Japanese, descent, but, embedded in Western culture. And so there's this sense for me of always being, kind of neither here nor there, straddling the two cultures in some way. And largely, when I think about Japan, I grew up in the States. Japan was this imaginary place that had a certain kind of, once again, a kind of a feeling tone. It had certain signifiers, the box of senbei, of rice crackers that would come every Christmas, and, certain kinds of children's books that I would receive. And I think you probably have a similar type of relationship with it as well. And what I'm interested in, what I'm getting at here is the fact that your first two books were set in Japan, and then you moved completely away from Japan. Whereas I've always, continued to try in some futile kind of way to straddle the two cultures. So I'm just curious about your thoughts about that, how you made that shift, why you started in Japan, and then why you made the shift to a Western culture.
There are probably many things that we should swap notes on about our relationship to Japan. But we'll start with this one. I mean, and I'll be curious to compare it to your the journey you've made as a writer vis-a-vis Japan. But for me, I started to write about Japan quite unexpectedly on my part. And I mean, that might surprise people because today, I mean, if somebody has some sort of, if they have ethnic roots other than in the kind of the mainstream host culture, that's an obvious starting place for your first novel. That wasn't the case when I started to write in England. I mean, nobody was doing things like that. And it felt like if you did if I started to write about Japan, no one would want to read me. And so I was trying to write about, English things, but not getting very far. But then it was almost like a compulsion hit me when I was 24 years old. And quite suddenly, with a sense of urgency, I really, really wanted to create stories set in a Japan, but a very specific Japan. A Japan that I imagined to be the Japan just before I was born, in the dying days of the Second World War and immediately after that. And it's only later on I kind of analyzed this and realized that what was happening was that I'd grown up ever since I was a boy of 5 when I left Japan with this, like with this place called Japan in my head, which I thought was a real place for a long time, because possibly unlike you, I had plenty of memories of the real Japan, which I kind of nurtured and developed while I was growing up in England. And this was kind of more vivid for me in a way because I was always expecting to go back to Japan at any point, and that's where my life was going to continue. So, and like you, exactly, yes, I used to get these parcels every month full of kind of Japanese comics and all this. So there were things to feed my imaginary Japan, not just the memories. And my parents, once again, they're Japanese people who expected to return to Japan, the following year. So they carried on talking about Japanese things. So I had built up this very important world in my head called Japan. And suddenly when I was around 24, I think I realized, first of all, that it actually didn't exist. I couldn't get on a plane and go to this place because it was just some sort of strange mixture in my head of kind of memory and speculation and imagination. But the important thing I realized was that it was fading away. Every year I got older, it was getting fainter and fainter. And I think that's why I stopped writing songs. It became very urgent for me to try and get this world down, in a work of fiction. It almost didn't matter to me what the story was. I just needed to get into that world. But in order to build that world, I did need a story, because I needed emotions, I needed the feelings. And I think that's what kind of kick-started my career as a writer. And so Japan was a very important starting point for me. It wasn't it wasn't the usual thing. I mean, maybe it's not the usual thing. I don't know. But it wasn't the thing of wanting to explore my roots so much as just trying to preserve or conserve this thing that was quite precious before it disappeared out of my head. And then you asked about, why I moved on. Well, that was a whole different thing. I mean, after my second novel, but both my first novels, set in this place I call Japan, I started to get kind of frustrated because, these books had been, in their own way, they were quite acclaimed in Britain, and people were praising me. But I always, they were being read as books about Japan. If they were praised, or this is a caricature, but if they were praised, people say, he gives you a real insight into the Japanese mind, or or if you want to understand, the Japanese and what they went through, in the 20th century, you could do far worse than read Ishiguro's novels. And I, well, first of all, I thought I was a bit of a phony because I didn't think I had the qualifications to really represent, my parents' generation at all, because this was just my imaginary thing. But also, it was a more selfish thing. I thought I was writing kind of like universal stories, you know, stories that were about everybody.
Yeah.
I thought I was going for kind of like what I thought were big themes, you know,
Yeah.
and then people would just say, oh, that's interesting. That's how Japanese people felt then.
Yeah.
And I always felt I was being kind of narrowed down into a kind of like a foreign correspondent in the West.
Yeah.
And so I made a very conscious decision, which was also kind of a personal test to myself. You know, would I actually be able to function as a novelist without Japan? You know, what if I just write the most English kind of novel possible and show it to the English? You know, will they accept it? And would I be able to write such a thing? And would I be read like that? That was a very important question for me. So it was a very conscious decision to write The Remains of the Day. I mean, it's not a coincidence. It's this kind of ultra English kind of almost
The
like
British
a
country
pastiche.
house. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just taking on every big kind of English motif thing. Yeah, there.
And what happened?
So that,
yeah. And so then what happened?
It became sort of my biggest kind of hit record, you know. And so I thought that was very interesting. It said something interesting about me. It said something interesting about the readership, the ability to kind of accept that a young, because I was just, you know, still in my early 30s, a young, as they saw it, a Japanese guy, was allowed to write about English society, you know, before and after the Second World War, like that. I mean, so I thought that was an interesting thing.
It's interesting. Yeah, sorry.
No, I can't now. All right, so that's my story. Now I'm kind of curious because you've not done what I've done, right? You've always, there tends to be a character. I'm not saying this character is like you personally, but there is a kind of anchoring character in all your books who is kind of at least partly Japanese. Right?
That's right.
Now,
well, first of all, I just want to go back to what you said though, because because what I think is interesting is that I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but what people responded to in Remains of the Day was this sense of this is a, you know, this moment where, you know, a character, the scales drop from his eyes and he looks back on his life and realizes that things were not what he thought they were. And, you know, that this is a sort of a universal human theme that is recognized, you know, that you know, readers recognize, English-speaking readers recognize in a way that, you know, they see it as being universal rather than being something peculiar to, you know, peculiar to Japan. And so I think that that right there is a kind of an interesting, you know, I mean, you succeeded in doing exactly that.
But perhaps it also exposed something in the readership. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to accuse you know, the readers of my second, third novels of any particular kind of stereotyping or anything like this. But it seems to me The Remains of the Day was basically a rewrite of the previous novel, just that the previous novel was set in Japan and everyone said it was about the Japanese mind or you know, Japanese experience. Whereas when it wasn't set in Japan anymore, when it was set in a, you know, not even in contemporary Britain, it was set in some kind of fantasy Britain. People didn't say, "Oh, this is about the English mind." They said, "Oh, you know, this is about human experience."
right, a universal human experience because I recognize it.
So I thought that was interesting. But for me, it was kind of liberating.
I bet
because and you know, I felt I didn't have to have Japan. I didn't have to be a kind of the Japanese writer in the West. I could write about anybody, whatever, you know. It gave me a tremendous confidence and a tremendous freedom. But I'm kind of curious. I'm kind of curious to know what your own path is in relation to the Japanese thing.
I mean, I think that when I came to writing a bit late. I was already in my 40s when I started writing novels. And people were starting to write about their roots, you know. But in North America, the story that was being told was a story of the internment. You know, it was a post-World War story of of the Japanese internment. And these were wonderful books. There are many wonderful books and movies made of that. And it was a very empowering moment for me to read these. And at the same time, I knew I wanted to write something different. And I think it really was around, I think I read Remains of the Day early on. And it was very liberating for me to read that, because I thought, well, here's a Japanese writer who is writing about characters who are not at all, sort of within that, that sort of exploring your roots genre. And so that was very empowering for me as well. When I started writing my first book, I think, as I won't. For many writers, the first book is there sort of strong autobiographical elements to it. And in this case, for me, I wanted to, I was writing this novel about working in global media, global television. And I wanted to talk about, I wanted to talk about questions of, authentic representation in commercial media, and the way that commerce sort of affects that, or twists that. I wanted to, I was really thinking a lot about hybridity as a metaphor. And that's true for my second book as well. And so it made sense for me to, because I was really writing about straddling cultures, right? I was writing about the US and Japan. It made technical sense, structural sense to have a hybrid protagonist. And as soon as I started, writing that hybrid protagonist, I realized that I had a problem. And the problem was that because of the specificity, the racial specificity of that character, half Japanese, half American, half Caucasian American, that there was that readers automatically would make the assumption that that character was based on me, that it was me, right? That it was a thinly disguised version of myself. And that I realized that that this is not a problem that a more, and forgive me for this, but a more generic, in other words, Caucasian, say, male writer would have to worry about. I think if a white guy is writing a story about white guys, you don't automatically make that assumption that this is an autobiographical story. But the racial specificity of and the cultural specificity of my character meant that people were going to make that assumption. And so at the time I realized there's no getting around this. I can't fight it. It's just going to happen. And so I need to play with it. And so I ended up making my mixed race protagonist, I made her 6 feet tall, and I gave her green hair so that people could tell us apart, right? And that just became part of the way that I just decided, okay, if I'm going to write these characters, I'm going to have to figure out a way of treating, of holding this, right? And then the second novel, I was again writing about, hybridity and potato breeding in this case. And it again made a lot of sense to have a mixed race protagonist. And so again, I did the same sort of thing. It was funny because with the first novel, people still, even with the 6 feet tall and green hair, people still were saying, oh, that's you, right? And so in the second novel, I made the protagonist so unreliable and kind of screwed up that I figured people wouldn't dare ask me if it was an autobiographical character. But in fact, it still happened. So in the third novel, I just decided that's it. I'm taking off the mask. I'm just going to step inside the novel and give the character my name and play with it in a very overtly metafictional way. I've always been attracted to the kind of metafictional elements, that kind of the irony that allows you to play with. And so yeah, in the third novel, In a Tale for the Time Being, I called the character Ruth and figured, you know, let's just be done with this.
And do you think one day you'll write a book with somebody who couldn't possibly be mistaken
Well,
for
you
an
know,
autobiographical figure?
this is something, yeah, this is something I wanted to ask you too. You know, that would probably be my biggest challenge. And I was going to ask you if there's is there something that you feel that you want to do that you've never done before? I mean, that would, I think, certainly be mine, to write a book with a character who is completely and absolutely unlike me. That would probably be mine.
See, for me, I mean, it's easy because I've never written in that kind of way. I've never had, even when I was writing my Japanese novels, I never had a character that was like me. I mean, my protagonists were a much older generation. My first novel, it was a woman, like a woman, a deeply middle-aged woman, when I was in my 20s. And I don't think I've ever, I think it's just that, we all have our different kind of ways of relating to our material. And I've never related to my material through any kind of an alter ego character. Although I feel in a funny kind of way, I feel each of my books are in some kind of way, they're emotional autobiography. I mean, yesterday when I was doing a live event, I was asked the question, which of my books is my favorite? And I was saying, I honestly can't say, because I feel each one represents a particular phase in my life. And they all serve that function. They're not competing. And so I do feel that I have an intimate relationship with them. They do represent me. They're not things that I've constructed at arm's length at all. But it's not part of my way of doing things that there is a character like me. So it's very easy for me to just, I suppose it's quite easy for me to jettison things like Japan, relatively easy for me, or Japanese type characters. I know that, this whole business about how a novelist, fiction writer, relates to the material, shapes it, is a really complex thing. And I know that, we can never draw generalizations about this. I mean, for some people, it's absolutely crucial that there is a character who, even if it's only in an emblematic way, can stand in some kind of way, in a more literal sense, as a kind of autobiographical figure, and that's just the way the imagination opens up for a lot of writers. But it's for me, it's almost been the reverse. I get really self-conscious if there's somebody in my books that somebody might mistake for me, and because I just don't operate like that,
Interesting.
So yeah, I mean, so there's no reason why you should try and meet this challenge. I mean, I think that's just the way you write, and any more than I should. Try and actually have an autobiographical character in one of my novels. I mean, I think there are many, there have been many great writers, Tolstoy being a case where, rather egotistically, I think, every major character is some version of himself. There's about kind of 5 Tolstoys in War and Peace in different ages and different, whereas Shakespeare, it's very difficult to find like a Shakespeare character in any of those places. I think you get, these are very different approaches, but I am always I am fascinated by this. Why one thing, why the other?
Yeah. Well, me too. I mean, we could go on, and I just realized it's. I think we've now gone over, and that we really should ask Rick to come back, and you mentioned audience, questions. I suddenly remembered, it's not just you and me talking here in this intimate sort of way, but that we should actually include other people as well. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah, maybe we're being very unprofessional.
We're being very unprofessional. Rick, you should have just interrupted us.
I was so fascinated by this whole discussion. But I mean, I had other things to ask you.
I know.
Actually,
I have
about. No, never mind. All right. Okay. All right. Rick, sorry. Apologies, Rick.
Apologies, Rick. Sorry.
I've been keeping an eye on everybody, as it were, and it's we do have people from all over, and they're here. They're not. They haven't. There's been no back of the room stirring in the seats. I'm going back to where people look at their watches. But my colleagues were sort of, how are we doing? The questions have been coming in, although many of them I think have been answered in a way or one way or another. And I do think. I think one of the things that you two have really been doing is really made this live. It's easy for these to be kind of. I mean, we were talking beforehand, if you had too much of a conversation beforehand, it would all be used up and then you'd be sort of going through the motions here, but you've been doing this quite live and engaged. So I'm going to combine some of these questions a little bit because some of these were asked earlier on, but one I'll ask you, Ish, and this combines a few things. Could you talk a little about your process of working with editors along the way, and at what stage you do, and to the degree does a question of genre come up, or has it come up? I suppose, especially I think they're thinking of the last few books, which if the genre of fiction or other genre is seen as part of that conversation or matters or not.
I have a very straightforward relationship with editors, I think. Before I start dealing with editors at publishing houses, and you mentioned Sunny Mehta as a very important figure. There's a guy called Robert McCrum here in England who left publishing, but I mean he was the person who discovered me originally, and he was a very important figure. But I have a whole process of editing that happens in this house, whatever house I happen to be living in. Because when I first started to write short stories, as I was describing to Ruth just now, when I went over from being a guy with a guitar to someone kind of attempting to write a piece of fiction, Lorna, my wife, was then my girlfriend, and she just thought, who is this guy who fancies himself as a writer? And she would criticize my early fictions quite severely. I mean, very encouragingly, but without any inhibition, because she wasn't criticizing or advising like a published writer. And that relationship has remained more or less the same. If anything, I mean, she's got more and more severe. And everything I write, I have to get past her. And I always think I finished a book, and then she tells me I've got several more months to do. And recently now, my daughter is a novelist. Her book is coming out in Britain in 2 weeks' time, and she's already published a book of short stories. I have to get past her now. Oh yeah, well, absolutely. That's a collection of short stories, and she has another. And it's really tough for me because I have to get past my wife, who tells me, I've got to change this, and I've got to rewrite this complete. And then this time for Klara and the Sun, I got a whole ton of notes from my daughter when I thought I got past my wife, and that was about another 2 months of work. And then it goes out to the professional editors, and then we have discussions and things like this. But I'd say that one of the dangers for people like me who've been around for a long time and have won kind of Nobel Prizes and things like this is that people aren't as frank anymore about their opinions. And so, I have to really rely on, these women in my family, but also on my editors to not be afraid to say, look, I mean, I don't care what your reputation is. This bit is just junk. I need people to say that. The business about genre is really interesting, and we touched on that. Ruth and I touched on it a little bit just now. But I think you might have something to say about this. Rick and Claire and Sam. I mean, to some extent, what we have come to call genre is something I feel has been largely defined by the book industry, and to some extent by booksellers. You put these kind of you put kind of horror or sci-fi or something up on a section of your shelf, and there's a genre, you know. And I think this is very convenient way of getting certain books to certain readers. But I think there is a danger that if we think too rigidly in terms of genre, so that publishers actually, you know, designing their covers and everything, you know, very much within these boundaries, that it's actually going to restrict both the writing and the reading of books. You know, that sometimes a book will not reach the readers it should do, and also that sometimes writers will not actually reach for the imaginative resources they could do because they think it's in some other genre. You know, somebody has put up some fences. And I was talking to Ruth then about a feeling that I had to kind of push myself to move out of kind of the Japanese thing into a non-Japanese way of writing. When I wrote Never Let Me Go, I felt I had to actually, this was some years back now, but you know, I felt I had to actually seek permission as a kind of literary author to write a book that people might consider to be a sci-fi book. And it was only because of the younger generation of writers who were emerging at that point, people like David Mitchell, people like that, who were really embracing these other genres, and who deeply impressed me, that I thought, oh, you know, I could do that as well. But somebody of my generation, there was quite a lot of prejudice about kind of using sci-fi. You know, of course, there were great models like Margaret Atwood or Doris Lessing, you know, people who'd done this. But even Margaret Atwood, I would say, a book like The Handmaid's Tale did not become acclaimed until much later. That book was published in 1986, I think, and it really, you know, became recognized for the great book it is, you know, much later in this century, I'd say. You know. So that's something I would just say to everyone. You know, yes, I think it's great to have these kind of categories, but let's remember that they're just convenient things. You know, they shouldn't stop you reading across the boundaries or writing across the boundaries.
Yeah, I would say we had a great embodiment of that in Portland near Seattle. Ursula K. Le Guin, who wrote in all the forms and addressed everyone in all the forms. In fact, she was the very first person ever believed to write a praising review of Salman Rushdie's first book, Grimus. So, I mean, she was such a great example for that. The question for both of you, and then I'll move to a few more questions about the new book. But this one for both of you, because it's drawn from reading of your books that are already Gabby, who is in Corvallis, has read. For both of you, drawing naming books, is the notion of who this reader is saying she's haunted by reading your books. I mean, there's a feeling of haunting. Is the notion of being haunted or you know, come at in some way? Do your stories or grow out of those kind of feelings or questions that you're being haunted, or, you know, like that's what's prompting you to drive that?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure if I understand Gabby's question there. Is she saying that, is it because I'm haunted by certain questions that possibly the novels take on this quality of being haunting? Do you think that's what Gabby is asking?
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I responded to, I think that's an amazing question. And I think, yes, it's for me, it's very true that I've always felt that I write out of remorse in some way. And remorse is, of course, a kind of haunting. And, you know, so decisions that I made, you know, stupid things that I did, you know, when I was younger, you know, these kinds of things haunt me. And so then, you know, the nice thing about writing is, I mean, for me anyway, it takes me, you know, years and years and years to write a book. And so, you know, it gives me a long time to kind of reflect on, you know, why is it that I made those decisions, and why, you know, where was the moment where things turned, and what might I have done differently? So in a way, the novel is a kind of a you know, a thought experiment in and a way of investigating exactly that, those things that that I feel remorseful about. And, in a way it's kind of good because I never stop doing things that I feel remorseful about. So it also means that I never will, run out of things to write about, which, as an author, as a writer, it's very heartening. As a human being, it causes me a little distress, but.
I agree with what Ruth just said there. And I think, I'm wondering if Gabby hasn't hit on this thing that I've been looking for.
Yes, exactly.
Because it's beautifully simple in a way. I mean, if you go into a project because you're trying to actually deal with unresolved questions, maybe then, and they're still unresolved in a way. They may be slightly more resolved, but still there's a large element of the unresolved. That at the end of it inevitably, perhaps then that haunting quality might actually survive in the reader's mind. That I think that's beautifully simple, and I think that's quite convincing actually.
I do.
You go in there with things that haunt you. You're like you've got more chance of writing a haunting book. I mean, it's a kind of yeah. I mean that seems to be. I think many interesting, artistically profound things or artistically profound challenges are to do with those things that are unresolved within us. Not just in me, but perhaps in the readers and in the world at large. That they're not really, well, sometimes, I could have a whole kind of thing worked out. I could have a whole statement that I want to put to the world, and here it is, But often I think really interesting works of not just literature, but music and paintings. I mean, it actually, it seems to embody this kind of lack of resolution, a kind of a bemusement. And maybe, I think Gabby's onto something there. See, I learn everything every day. No, I mean, I just want to get to a point where I can bottle this quality and bring it out every time I write. Thank you very much, Gabby.
Thank you, Gabby.
Good. So this question from Nita here in Seattle, who has read the book. In fact, she sums up how, I mean, I may have to say something about reading your books with excitement. You sometimes read too quickly, and that's not the case for her, but I always want to go back and reread more slowly. But here's Nita's comment and question. I kept feeling that Klara and the Sun was an allegory for our current world. I picture today's teenagers glued to their phones as the book's teens with AFs, the effort to destroy the polluting machine. This is for those of you who haven't read the book, but this is some features in this part of the story. Current efforts to conquer climate change. I did puzzle over what the sun might represent, S-U-N, the universe, and the manager. I was asking for answers to these questions. And I must say, I was so enthralled and concerned about the characters that I had to read the book in one sitting. So that's Nita's comments and questions.
I'm kind of conscious that I've said very little in this whole session about Klara and the Sun. And I'm probably in big trouble with my publishers for this.
They can blame me. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to blame Ruth. So I'm just going to say very, very quickly that Klara and the Sun is, in a nutshell, is about this little robot girl who has been created, like all her peers in the shop, to prevent teenagers from becoming lonely. And at the beginning, the passage I read out, she's like a tabula rasa. She has no history, but she's learning at an exponential rate about the human world that she's going to have to inhabit. So she's just staring out the window, and she's seeing the world outside in the street, very much in terms of loneliness, because that's what one of her purposes in life. She's kind of saying, well, maybe they move like that because they're trying to avoid being lonely, or I wonder if the people crossing are lonely. And then eventually she goes out into, she's bought by a family, and she goes out into this kind of remote part of America. And her task really for the rest of the book is to try and prevent this family from heartbreak. And she thinks that she can depend on the son to help her. Okay, so that basically is the story in a nutshell. I'm not quite sure if I can answer that all the questions that were put to me, but I mean, is it a parable for today? I mean, there may be echoes of contemporary issues, and it's a world that has been where things like artificial intelligence and gene editing have become every day, so that no one remarks on the fact that Klara is this artificial robot. She's as ubiquitous as a bicycle or a vacuum cleaner, and I suppose but I'm not really just trying to hold up a mirror to contemporary society. I am trying to get back to these very old questions through Klara's eyes. Do human beings have a kind of a soul? Is there something inside each individual human being, some kind of strange ghosty thing inside that makes each human being very special and unique? Or in fact, is this just some sort of illusion that human beings have, and that actually, they're more or less replaceable, interchangeable, and she, in particular, she starts to ask, what is the nature of this thing called human love? What does it mean when they say they love this particular individual, but not this one? And why is this person irreplaceable? If you have enough kind of data and algorithms, why wouldn't you be able to replace this particular person should they die? So these are the questions I was asking, and of course I've tried to put it in a kind of a futuristic setting, but I'm really going back to these very old questions about what is it that makes each individual person special? Is there anything there, or are we just being sentimental? So I mean, I can only answer the question in that way.
No, that's yeah. Then this may be a follow-up to that, because this is Karen in Seattle asking this, because she's asking about Klara, her sense of spirituality, since she's not human, and maybe you answered this. I guess I'm just trying to. These questions have come out in different phrasings, about thoughts about how that functions within the story of Klara's sense of meaning and spirituality.
Well, I don't know if it's spirituality, but one of the origins of Klara in my imagination, wasn't really, she didn't come out of these kind of sci-fi books, and she wasn't really related to kind of sci-fi robots or androids. She came out of books for small children. I very much had her like I actually literally had a short little story that could be used for one of those picture books with beautiful illustrations that you could read to kids of 4 or 5. And so Klara for me was more related to like a doll, or like an animal that talks in small children's books. So when I decided to use her in this quite dark adult story, I wanted to keep her almost like a figure from one of those children's books, at least in one respect. I wanted her always to have this sense of hope and this kind of trust in the goodness in the world. that there was somebody watching over her all the time. In her case, she thinks it's a sun because she's solar powered, but she thinks there's this kind of all-powerful thing that watches benevolently over not just her, but over the whole world, over humans as well. And so I wanted that sense that comes out of young children's books. I'm fascinated by the world of young children's books, because particularly the illustrations as much as the stories, because they seem full of the adult world's wish to shelter the 4-year-old or 5-year-old and say, look, it's a kind, nice world, look forward to it. But there's something there's always something, often in the illustrations, there's a darkness, or there's hints of sadness in the way the clouds are drawn, or in the shadows of the trees. So there's something, you can see the conflict in the adult world, saying, look, we want to shelter you, but we don't want to lie to you. We want to start preparing you a little bit. And so I wanted that quality in Klara herself. So I'm not sure, Karen, if that is spirituality necessarily, but it's that I wanted her to have that quality, and I wanted her to keep it all the way through. She never loses faith in the presence of some goodness in the world that will come to the rescue.
Good. I think because of time, we're going to just do about 2 more questions, and that's with so many questions and comments. The Q&A is also working like a chat with a lot of enthused comments and comments and all. But this one question is also because we're talking about the, I guess, the human aspect, but you also have there's questions about landscape and setting, and one particular from someone else who's read the book by their question, and I've lost the question because I was scrolling around here, but the question was about Klara and the grasses. She walks between houses, and the grasses seem to have a lot of presence in the narrative. Is there a significance there that you would talk about, or is it just there? What would you say?
I didn't really think there was anything particularly special about the grass as such. But yeah, I mean, the landscape was quite important to me. I mean, I can't really justify these, the decisions to have the kind of the visual images I had, other than that I wanted them there. But I was quite, I had all these kind of American painters from the 1930s, Edward Hopper to some extent, but Ralston Crawford, Charles Sheeler, Grant Hill, the kind of realist painters of a certain period. And they often did these kind of big landscapes with nobody in them, kind of very lonely, landscapes. And you often saw grass or fields and a big sky, and maybe just a kind of like a grain silo on the horizon or something. And so I wanted a lot of those images in the book, and in the cities I wanted images of kind of like tall buildings with shafts of sunlight coming down, and maybe a lot of the loneliness of the Edward Hopper paintings. So in the past I've often kind of had kind of musical inspiration. In this one, I think I had a lot of visual inspiration. I wasn't particularly aware of the grass being symbolic of anything, other than that it's when she goes from A to B, she has to kind of more or less fight her way through. It's almost like a jungle, and it's a kind of it's almost like an emotional terrain that she has to cross. So I thought that the grass is quite helpful in that sense, because it could be welcoming and soothing, and it can be quite hostile, and so it just changes according to how she's feeling. Yeah, I mean, so that's how the grass is used in it.
I'm a child of the Central Plains in the U.S., so that and the experience of walking in tall, windblown grasses is I mean, that resonated when I read that part of the book too. I was like, oh yes, that kind of walk. I'm gonna actually sneak in one more question, but that's for both of you about the writing, which is about narrators, this is from Amy in Washington, D.C. First person versus third person, what choices get made and why those choices? That's for, that's for both of you.
Ruth?
Sure. I mix it up. I very often will have a first person narrator. I think in my first book, I had a first person narrator and a third person narrator. In other words, I had two protagonists, one written in the first person, one in the third. In A Tale for the Time Being, I did the same thing. I had the Ruth character, of course, writing in the third person, written in the third person, just to create, once again, play with that, the sort of metafictional aspects of having a character named after oneself in the book. And so I remember, when I first tried that with my first novel, I remember thinking, this is terrible, that this isn't the way novels ought to be written. You should have a consistent voice, and that voice should carry the narrative all the all the way through. And I also knew that the two characters, the first person character and the third person character, were at some point in the novel towards the end, they were going to have to meet. And I was panicked because I thought, what's going to happen when the two of them meet? How am I going to write that? It was seriously, I was really terrified. And then, of course, when I actually got there, I realized, well, of course, you just write it from one person's point of view, and then you write it from the other person's point of view, and the problem solved itself. And since then, I've just, I don't know, it's just that I hear the voices, I hear the voices of the characters, and sometimes it's in the first person and sometimes it's in the third. And once again, I think this is probably has to do with a kind of mixed race identity thing. I just can't seem to ever settle into one narrative identity in the same way I can't seem to settle into one genre. There's a restlessness there and a need to see things from multiple points of view.
Well, I mean, I really almost always write from the first person because I'm not being falsely modest here. I can't do anything else. It's like I'm a guitar player and someone says, well, would you like to play the church organ? And I say, well, no, I can't. Third person actually bewilders me, and so many people use it very flexibly as well. They do this thing called close third. My daughter is very good at close third, where it just kind of, you move very intimately into a character in the third person, so it's almost like first person. Then you pull out again, and then you move into somebody else. I can't do things like that, but there's a certain advantage in terms of my projects of using first person, because I really work with the restrictions of vision of the narrator. The fact that the narrator doesn't have perspective is absolutely crucial. And often the reader has more perspective than the narrator. And in the case of Klara, I mean, particularly at the beginning, I mean, she's very new to the world. I mean, she watches and she gets 2 and 2 and she makes 8, because she doesn't really understand the world. And so for me, it goes right into my themes to use first person. And often I've needed first person because I'm actually writing to explore how people hide from their pasts and deny them, try and play hide and seek with what they know about their pasts. And also in books like Never Let Me Go and Klara and the Sun, they're deceived about the future. They won't quite look clearly at the future. And that might come across like, denying the inevitable, but with somebody like Klara, it could come over like hope, and optimism. But I've always been fascinated by the way people, lie to themselves. I mean, that sounds rather pejorative, but the way at least they reframe things and tell themselves things, about the past and about the future. So for me, I'm very comfortable in the first person. And anyway, I don't know how to do anything else.
I think with the time we're at, we should probably maybe bring this to a close. There are so many more questions for both of you. about the book, about the other books. I think for people with questions for Ruth in particular, hold on to them for 6 more months, although you'll have a new set of questions with the new book to ask, because hopefully she'll be doing some things like this one way or the other. And many of the questions were about writing process and such, but those will, we can't do them all. And I think what you've both given us have been this wonderful, especially just some of the places you've gone in a very live way, have gone beyond the usual terrain of these kinds of programs that would happen live or in this way. But I don't know if either of you have anything anything else to say. And as we close out, I've got very few things at the end, little housekeeping things and all that. But
just thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to talk with Ish. I really enjoyed this, and thank you guys for putting it all together. I miss you. I miss the West Coast. I hope to see you all in person soon again.
And likewise, I want to thank Rick and Claire and Sam, and yeah, I too miss Seattle and the West Coast. And thank you, Ruth. I wasn't kidding when I said I had a whole bunch more questions to ask you, because I don't usually speak to people with this kind of not dissimilar relationship to Japanese culture.
Yes.
And so I just had these questions about how actual people like Japanese filmmakers, Japanese authors, or particular generations that had, whether they were an influence on you or not. And I wanted to confess that I found writers like Kawabata completely and utterly baffling, but I felt under great pressure to say that I loved them. And I wondered if you had that experience, but we probably haven't got time. Next time we have to do this another
next time. We'll have to do this another time. Oh, well, maybe actually we can do this again when my book comes out,
Yes, well, maybe.
We'll just pick up where we stopped. No interruption at all.
We'll all be for that. Both of you, wow. Great. For those of you with us watching, a little bit of housekeeping. I know there have been questions about getting copies of the books, and which came out still just 10 days ago, 11 days ago, last Tuesday. This is Klara and the Sun I'm speaking of. So many of those are already on the way. Some of you, I think, have gotten them, at least by reports I've seen, but give our somewhat beleaguered U.S. Postal Service a little patience, especially some of you farther away from Seattle, but all three of us, Village and Third Place and LA Bay, are mailing them out, and we will keep mailing them out as we get our final tally of people who are here. Also, I think everyone attending will, because we didn't do this in sort of a chat mechanism here, will get, I think the plan is an email about both Ish and Ruth's other books, her earlier titles, as well as some more information, because she's been mentioned here, Naomi Ishiguro and her book of stories, Escape Routes, and this novel that's about to come out called Common Ground. And the link that we'll put in to get it, because it's not in the US and there's not even any imminent plans for it, but some of us at Elliott Bay will be ordering it from Mr. B's bookshop, emporium, a book emporium in Bath, England, a bookshop that Naomi Ishiguro worked in. And I think I heard Ish in a radio interview talk about her role as a bookseller. And when he was described Klara and the Sun, an earlier iteration of it, as this children's book, and she just sort of ruled it out as a daughter, as a reader, and as a bookseller, saying, no, it can't be. You have to. This is not for little children. This story, so her work is to be looked forward to too. So I think it's well into the evening where Ish is, and it's moving into evening where Ruth is.
Like it's dark, yeah.
Yes, I know. We're 3 o'clock used to be dark in Seattle at this time of day. Now we're moving into spring. So we thank you both. We thank everyone, and for all of us at LA Bay, we also thank our colleagues, Claire and all her. It's been funny to hear her name mentioned. It's like Klara, not Klara as the book, but Claire of Village Books in Bellingham, and Sam of Third Place Books here, Kathy Zuckerman way behind the scenes, but also really make everything happen with Alfred Knopf in New York. And again, both of you, Ruth Ozeki and Kazuo Ishiguro, thank you so much. Thank you for the work, and thank you for this wonderful time.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.